Welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. In the previous video, we saw how we could utilize an existing database schema from, say, an ERP system, BW, CRM, and access that content inside of our project and inside of our container and even extend it with HANA-specific features. Now, what we want to do is take the concepts that we learned previously and apply them to other HDI containers. So imagine that instead of connecting to an existing ERP schema, where it's an ABAP managed schema, the ABAP data dictionary is managing it, we want to connect to another existing HDI container. As you do more and more new development in the HDI environment, you're going to have other views and maybe other tables in other projects, and you're going to want to access those from within your project as well. Even if the ultimate source of your data is still ERP, you might have views created by other teams and other projects that you want to build on top of in your own project and layer view on top of view. And for that, those other calculation views or SQL views are going to be in HDI containers, and we're going to need to be able to access those as well. And although the concepts are basically the same, that we need a synonym in order to access anything outside of our container, and then we're going to need to grant access to our technical user in order to access the other container. The technical process is actually a little bit simpler when we're dealing with containers, because containers inherently kind of know how to talk to other containers. So we don't need quite as much of a setup process with the user provided service and things like that in order to be able to grant the access. We're actually going to look at two different scenarios. In this video, we're going to start more simply where we have two containers, but they're both inside of the same project. And I want to stress, this is, this may be common, but this isn't what you should do like in a large-scale modeling environment. You should not put everything inside of one project just because it makes things a little simpler. That's not the right approach. Things that go in the same project should be part of the same application. And sometimes you just want to separate the data out and not allow total access to all parts of your data model. Maybe you have some tables that you want to have more controlled access to inside the same project, inside the same application, so you want to separate them into a separate container inside the same project. That's what we're going to look at in this video. Then in the next video in the series, we'll look at the more common scenario of another HDI container, but one that exists from someone else's project, from a separate project that's already been deployed onto your development system. Okay? And we're actually going to start here by adding another module to our project. So we're going to put this in a completely separate HANA database module. And this is fine. You can have multiple database modules in a project. As I said, you don't want to overuse this approach or abuse it for things that isn't intended. But what I want to do is I want to create some user tables and have more controlled access to them. I don't want them to be in my main database module. I want to put them into a separate database module, but still in the same project. Okay, so I'll say UserDB is the name of the module. And then we do not want to use namespaces. Namespaces are only there for backwards compatibility with the old HANA repository, where everything was global. So we needed to take the package structure, the folder structure, and attach it to the name of the object to keep everything unique. In the new environment with HDI, everything is local to the container anyway, so it's not really required to use a namespace. It just creates very long artifact names, and I find that most developers don't really like that long name. So although you can still use the namespace, it's no longer necessarily pulled from the total folder structure. If you need it for backwards compatibility to keep the same name as what you had in the old environment when you're migrating content, you can do that. But really for new development, there's no point in using that namespace. Next, we can give a schema name. We don't actually have to. A container, when you build, will generate the schema for you, but it'd just be a random string of numbers and letters. And particularly if you're going to allow database access to the container, like reporting tools to access it, that's not going to be very user-friendly. You probably want to give it an actual name. So we'll say Open SAP HANA user, and we'll go ahead and put a group number on the end here, although that's not actually required either. Even if two developers would build with the same schema name, the Web IDE is automatically going to put an underscore and a number on the end anyway to keep them unique. Now, that uniqueness only happens when you build from the Web IDE. If you actually package the entire project and deploy it, which we haven't done. We'll do that at the very end of the series. So we will show you how to do that, like how you transport to another system. But when you do that, then the schema name stays static. It stays whatever you specify here. Because when you're deploying into a QA or production system, you're assuming you don't want that parallel deployment of multiple sandboxed versions. But that's an important point. When we talk about cross-container consumption, you want a stable version of your container when you're done developing it. When you build in the Web IDE, that's really for your private sandbox version. So one of the major differences that we talk about here in this environment is when you're done developing your private version, you've built it in the Web IDE, you've tested it, you're not really done. And that's not really the development version of the artifact. You should still package your entire project and deploy it back into the development system so that other developers can consume that stable finished version and not your sandboxed temporary version. But we'll talk about that more later when we come sort of to the end of the series and we talk about transporting into a downstream system. We'll come back and we'll revisit that topic. Of course, remember earlier we talked about how you can target a particular HANA version. We'll stay with the latest version here. That's what I'm running anyway. And we'll go ahead and we'll click Finish. And what we'll see is it has generated the module for us, and it has added that module to the MTA YAML. But we want to make a few changes to that. It's also created a separate HDI resource, this HDI UserDB. So it means it's going to create a whole separate schema in the database and a separate set of technical users, completely isolated from our other database module. Just because these two are in the same project doesn't mean that they can see each other or they interact or they share anything by default. They're still completely isolated. The only thing I want to do here is because the wizard generates kind of a generic name, HDI container _2. That's fine. You can't know any better, but let's just make that a little more user-friendly and actually say that this is the user container name. It just makes it easier for us developing or somebody else looking at our code to, when they see the container name, to know that this is the user container instead of the main container. Okay? So we'll save that. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to go over to the modules and go to UserDB. And like we did in the much earlier exercise, we want to add the target container property here, just in case we want to add more configuration, more resources to this project down the road. And we'll set up an alias here, user container name. All right, there we are. So we're good with our configuration. Now, the other thing we need to do is we need to wire the two containers together. So what I'm going to do here, switch to the code editor and switch back to refresh these. But now I'm going to go to the database module, and we have two container resources. We've got the main HDI container, we've got the user provided service from the previous exercise to connect up to S-Flight. But we're going to basically do the same thing here and add our other container. So we're going to come here to our HDI user DB resource. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have to add this service replacements, S on the end there. That's important. And then we have to set some properties here. So key. The key name will be HDI user service, and then the service, we're going to give it an alias, user container name. All right. So that's going to allow us, just like we did in the previous exercise, we created grantors, an HTTP grantor file that used the user-provided service to grant access to our container technical user in DB module. We're going to do the same thing. We're connecting up to the UserDB resource, the other HDI container that will be generated for this UserDB, and we're going to be able to create a grantor file that also grants access cross-container between these two containers in the same project. But we don't need a user-provided service because the two containers are in the same project. They implicitly trust each other. Okay, that's the layer of complexity that we remove if we have both modules in the same project. They do automatically trust each other. We don't need to set anything extra there. Okay. All right. Now, what we have here in this UserDB is I want to get a couple of development artifacts. We don't want to necessarily sit here and create them all. That would be a little redundant at this point. We've already seen how to create many of these. So what I've prepared is I've prepared a little zip file that already has them in it. We're just gonna download the zip file. I'll put it here in my folder where we're working. All right, I got the zip file. Now I'm going to come here to the UserDB module, and I'm going to right mouse click, and I'm going to import that zip file. Let's go find that. There it is. And make sure that it's importing into UserDB src. We do want to extract the archive. And we say, okay, yes, there's some objects already in there. That's fine. Let's import them anyway. And what we see is that this is actually imported a whole bunch of objects. We've got a user table with an identity column. We've got some roles. I actually have a calculation view, a stored procedure. So it's ready to go. Maybe more stuff than what we're ready to talk about yet. We haven't talked about creating procedures and stored procedures, but we want to use them in this particular example. So kind of just know that there's a bunch of good stuff there. And let's go ahead and build this UserDB module so that we can get it created and get all of its artifacts and get its container created and all the artifacts within its container. That a second to finish up. It's creating the schema, the technical users, and adjusting the roles, and there we are. It is successful. So we got our new tables and stored procedures and stuff like that in this UserDB. I could come over to the Database Explorer and I could add another connection here and connect to that container now, the UserDB container. Let's just go ahead and shorten that name and say okay. It's a completely separate container, completely separate technical users, but I could then see that content. The user data is there. I could even, I think I have a stored procedure here to even initialize a little bit of data. Go ahead and call this. Let's just create, I don't know, 10 records. We'll run that. That's good. And when we come back to the table, notice there I didn't use CSV files in the table data. I just wrote a little script that will dynamically generate data. I didn't have that much data in here, just a first name, last name, and email address. It didn't really matter what was in there too much, just so we get a couple of records for testing purposes. That's fine. So our container is good. It's ready to go. Now we want to finish connecting it up to our DB module so that we can access it from here. So we're going to go to the config file just like we did before and create a grants. I'll just create another one. Call this one user HDB grants. There we are. And the syntax is going to be really very similar to what we did in the previous exercise. X215. Let's just grab it. It's going to say using this service, which is just the alias for the other container. Then our object owner, give it this particular role, the user pound role, and the application user, give it the user role. So we can see these roles. We can come here to this other project, and we can see here's the user role that's going to give out. It's going to give select access, insert, update, pretty broad access. And we have a analytic privilege on our calculation view. It's going to give that access. But also importantly here, the object owner is going to get the user owner role, which is just the pound role. So it will then in turn be able to grant that role to other users. Okay, so we'll save that. And we want to create some synonyms, just like we did before. I created this synonym in the data folder. You know, we're starting to get a couple synonyms, so it probably makes sense at this point, break it out into its own folder. Once again, this folder structure is completely arbitrary. It's just for organizational purposes, but I like to be organized. So I'm going to take the synonym that we had before, and I'm going to move it down here. And then let's create a new synonym. And what do we want to name it? We want to name it user. And once again, we can just add the entries here. Let's give access to the table itself. This user data.user. That was the name over here, user data.user. Names don't have to match once again. In fact, let's do one here that doesn't match. Let's name this one user details, but the actual target object is, let's go select it here. I don't want to type it in. Let's choose it there, and user model. There's the calculation view that I want to pull in, but I don't want it to have the schema name or database. We don't need any of that because it's local to the project. There we are. We'll save it. And now the only thing that we need to do here is actually going to have to come back here to the config folder, and we're going to want to add a synonym config file so that we don't have to hard code any of the target names. We can use a placeholder. But in order to do that, we first need to actually add this to our HDI config. Actually, newer versions of the deployer aren't going to require this. This is sort of something that we're going to improve down the road. But for now, we have to add this, just like the wizard generated the HDI config file in our source folder to map all the file extensions. We have to add the same thing here to add HDB synonym config to our config folder. It needs its own separate HDI config now. But like I said, the improvement that we plan to make in the near future, probably for SPS04, is that if there's no HDI config file in the config folder, it will just default back and use the one in the SRC folder. But today we can't do that just yet, so we'll go ahead and create a separate one here so it knows when we create an HDB synonym config what it's pointing to. Now let's create that HDI synonym config. So user HDB synonym config, and the little secret here is it opens the editor, and we could type all this in again or configure it again. But I'm actually going to open this in the code editor, and then I'm going to come down here to the synonym file, and I'm going to open it in the code editor. So the little trick here is it's basically the same syntax. We have to repeat everything, unfortunately. I would prefer if we could have the artifact or wizard or something where we didn't have to do this. But what we want to do is we want to tell it which grantor to use in order to create this synonym. And we have to do this for each object here. So I want to just add grantor and then HDI user service. Add a comma there. And you have to add this to each entry in your synonym file in this separate synonym config. Yeah, like I said, it would be kind of nice if we just had one file where we could put all that together, or if we had a wizard that would generate the synonym config from the main file, but we don't have that yet. So for now, just use that trick to cut and paste and then add your grantor. That's going to tell it which grantor, which security level to use to create those synonyms. That's fine. So now we are ready to do a build on our DB. And what we will see, give it a second to add the new synonyms and the new grants. And what we see here is, remember before we had the S flight. Now I'll let it finish so it doesn't jump around on me. There we are. Okay, it's successful. Let me scroll up here. I want to show you that earlier we had the S flight grants being processed. They're still being processed, but now in addition to that, we have the user grants being processed. And this was a SQL grant, but this is an HDI grant. So we see the difference there. Behind the scenes, it knows that the target is different. It's going to use a different technical mechanism. That's why we didn't need the user-provided service to be able to connect up those two. They automatically trust each other because they're in the same project. And then it created the synonyms. So now when we come back over here, let me close all these files, and I come to core DB and I look at the synonyms. Now I also have synonyms to my UserDB and even my my calculation view. I can read the data there. I can do the same thing here to the main table, or I can see that it's a synonym. It shows me the target information. That's rather nice. I haven't shown you a synonym description there before, but there you can see the preview of the data. And now those tables, even though the tables and the views, even though they're in the separate container, just those two that I've created synonyms for are accessible inside my main container. And that way I can keep some parts of this other container private. Maybe I would have other tables or other logic, other stored procedures, other views that I don't want to expose to the outside. I don't have to. I only have what I can create synonyms for. And vice versa. I can only create synonyms for what is in the role, so I could further restrict access even between two containers in the same project utilizing the roles.